We're really happy to have Bob with us this evening. For me, it's the first time I've had a chance to spend time with Bob since he left Microsoft. And, you know, this for me is, I know if I step down from this position, do what he did, I would look 20 years younger, because he definitely does. Bob, it's absolutely a thrill to have you with us this evening. We're really looking forward to what you have to say.
Great, thanks, Mary. Well, it's kind of funny that there was the print in there about the Harvard MBA, because in a way it leads very well into what I wanted to talk about tonight, which is leading by example. And that really turns out to be a discussion about values and values in companies and tech companies in particular. But I thought I'd begin today, and first of all I'll say it's been a great day. It's been a great opportunity to get to know the faculty and the students here at Harvey Mudd. It's clearly an amazing organization, amazing college that do some amazing things here for a lot of great folks. And the enthusiasm and excitement that I've seen from everybody that is here is really exemplary. So you have a lot to be proud of. What I wanted to do to start with was to just tell a little story. I mean, Marie and I were just talking about the first company I went to after I left university and went into industry, which was about 1981. I transitioned out from Michigan to go work for Rome Corporation in the Bay Area, and Rome made PBX systems for business, the predominant business they were in. And a number of years after I was there, Rome was purchased by IBM. And I joined Rome as a programmer. My training is computer science, and so I was a developer, and had the opportunity after a few years to lead a small team and became my first line development manager there. And sometime after I took on that role, as IBM began to become more involved in Rome, IBM managers were more involved in managing Rome projects, and I was actually reporting to a second line IBM manager, very good guy by the way. And one day he took me aside and he said to me, he said, Bob, you do a lot of things right, and I really like what you do. He said, but one thing you have to change is that you are too close to your people. You're too friendly with them. That you're too, you know what's going on. You live in with their lives. You spend time with them. And you have to create distance between yourself and your people. I have never accepted that, and I've never chosen to operate that way. And that's not to say that his name was Don. That's not to say Don was wrong, because it was an approach to how you lead, an approach to management. And there are different approaches, and sometimes things are work in one situation and sometimes they don't work in another. Culturally at IBM, the company was used to, and it was very common for senior, for managers, not even senior managers, but managers to have distance from employees, and there was very clear roles and responsibilities that were distinct, that were different. People who were writing code, wrote code, and people who were managing, and you didn't really have that combination. And there's certainly circumstances where that makes sense. I mean, interestingly enough, I do a fair amount of work in my business with our government organizations in the military, and that sort of style of management of separating the leadership from the enlisted men and women is common in the military, and I think there's very good reason. I have a lot of respect for the work and the things that our armed services do, and certainly the leadership training that they provide. But in a sense, in that world, I think it's fairly easy to understand, because the officers are making decisions about the people that are their troops, that are life and death decisions, sending people into battle, and sometimes people don't come back. And so creating that kind of a separation is easily understandable. And I'm pleased to say I've had some difficult decisions, but I've never had to make that decision, and I hope I never have to. And in that context, I think that style of leadership isn't necessarily required, but it is an interesting attribute about how you lead. And I want to talk a lot about that, but I want to first take a couple of minutes to just share a little bit of the experience I've had in the what of leadership. And I had an opportunity to speak to a leadership class today, and I was glad to share some of my thoughts on this that Jay held. And it was a good class, a good group of students, and had some good conversations. And one of the things I shared there was one of the things I've learned over the years about what leadership is all about, is fundamentally you have to start with what does it mean to lead and to be a leader. And to me, it's fairly simple, which is that to be a leader, people have to follow you. And you need to take the steps that help to bring people along to get them to follow. And I have always found that there are sort of three key things that I always have to do and have to encourage my teams to do in order to really be successful in leading people. And the first one is have clarity of a strategy, know where you're going, have to be able to articulate that in a way that people understand. Don't be afraid to repeat it as many times as you need to, because it turns out that you can't repeat it too many times. And over communicating a strategy is not a mistake anyone can ever make. But being consistent about it is very important. Being clear, consistent, and not changing it all the time. Sometimes people are clear, but they then change it very frequently, and that doesn't work very well either. So being consistent over a period of time. The second thing is structure. Having a structure that is effective in helping people to do the jobs they need to do. I feel that as a leader, it's my job to try and effectively get people to work and put out 100% of what they can on every day. Can't always get that. That's kind of an impossible thing at some fundamental level. But if you can provide an environment that enables people to be as effective as they can be, then you're doing a significant thing that you need to do as a leader. And structure is important. It turns out that structure is required to make an organization run effectively. And I think there's structures that are inherent even in small organizations. A two-person startup has a structure to it. A large company that's building complicated software or hardware definitely has a structure, and process is a very important thing. And you have to be thoughtful about how process is done, because it can be overdone, and sometimes it becomes more of an impediment than a mechanism for success. But structure is a critical thing. And the third component, which you can never forget, is people. And people are really the thing, is what would make everything happen. And you need great people. You need great people who work together as a team. Without that team and an environment where people work effectively together, you just can't keep them as effective as they could be. But having people who are the right people and are able to work effectively is critical. But those three things are always really critical to being effective as a leader. So strategy, structure, and people. That's foundation. And in a way, that's the what of leading. And it's not inconsistent. I mean, if you read a lot of the books on leadership, you'll see things that say fairly similar things. And words are not, and people may use slightly different words and take on somewhat different approaches. But it's fairly well understood that those foundational capabilities are necessary to be effective as a leader and to help people follow you. The thing I want to spend time talking about tonight isn't the what, however, it's really the how. And gets back a bit to where I started with Don and this IBM manager sort of style of the how. And in that case, he was talking about the relationship of the manager to the employee. And there are differences I think there are different approaches there that are valid. Another part that I think is very interesting is how organizations function in the value sets that they operate on. The value sets that are inherent in an organization. And one of the things that I know to be true is the value set of an organization comes from its leadership. Particularly comes from its senior leadership. It is even more strongly derived from its founding leadership. And founders play a long-term critical role in establishing the culture and value set of an organization beyond the capacity really of any other leader. Although notable CEOs and notable leaders have had significant impact in the culture of organizations and teams. I do believe very strongly that the role of leadership is very foundational in establishing the way companies operate. I've often made the statement that all bad decisions are made by senior management. Sometimes they make good decisions, and some of the good decisions come from there. A lot of good decisions don't come from senior management, but I can guarantee you that all bad decisions come from senior management. And that's because ultimately, if a bad decision is made within the organization, then senior management is responsible for that decision and responsible for the person and the structure of the organization that goes in there. And I very fundamentally believe in taking responsibility for everything, and that's extremely important as a leader in an organization, particularly a senior leader, to take responsibility for everything. And this really does come back, this idea that value sets are driven by senior management really does speak to a lot of the impact that senior leaders can have in an organization. I've got some examples of companies that have different leadership sorts of the value sets and what they have to say and how value driven they are. I'll start with one where I'm not going to talk specifically the values, but one that I'm just sort of amazed by. Living in Seattle, I work in the Bay Area right now, but I live in Seattle, and so I'm back and forth between Seattle and the Bay Area. And if you're taking that flight, it's Alaska Airlines you're on. You're on Alaska an awful lot. And I find it interesting that 5 years ago, if you were to take a flight on Alaska from, let's say, San Jose to Seattle at 6 p.m., you could be guaranteed that flight would be 45 minutes late, at least. It was a guarantee. And if you wanted to have, if you checked a bag, it would take 30 to 40 minutes to get the bag in Seattle. And then all of a sudden, the leadership of the company made a decision to not be. And the flights are all on time. It's the #1 on-time airline in the company, in the country. And they have a 20-minute bag guarantee, and they're there in 20 minutes or less. And you see sometimes there's somebody sitting there as the bags come out. Somebody's sitting there with a monitor, taking a reading of those bags, verifying that in fact those bags came out in 20 minutes. That's because the leadership of Alaska Airlines decided to change. They decided to drive for excellence. That's the sorts of things that leaderships have, and it speaks to the values of customer service that I think are so important and so exemplary to what great companies do. And it's interesting. So we're looking at some values, and so one of the things that's interesting is you look at different industries and the value sets of different industries, and not surprisingly, companies that are focused on serving customers, retail companies as an example, tend to have fairly strong customer-oriented value sets. So one of my favorite examples is Nordstrom. You think about Nordstrom as being a company that really does focus on customer service. The customer seems like they're always right. There's the stories that people buy a pair of pants at Nordstrom and they wear it for a year and they bring it back and they return it and they take it. And they really do. They actually will take it in. It's sort of amazing, but they do that. And their sort of their mission really is they call it, I looked it up recently, leave it better than we found it. I think that's a strong statement. And underneath that, the value sets that you'll see for Nordstrom are supporting communities, sustaining the environment, protecting human rights, and caring for our people. Very strong, customer-focused value sets. Look at Coach handbags and leather goods. They focus on their brand. Brand is their touchstone. Customer satisfaction. Integrity is our way of life. Innovation drives performance, and collaboration amongst their people. And it's not surprising that these sorts of companies have strong value sets, and because they know they have to have a longevity that outlasts any individual leader inside the company. And the values are derived and the relationships are derived with customers over a long lifetime period. I think it's really interesting to contrast that and look at tech. I mean, this is a school that trains a lot of students and students that go into technology in some form. And I have been in technology my whole life. It is what my passion is. And I think if you look, the kinds of value sets that you see from a Nordstrom are somewhat uncommon in technology. And even if you read the web, sometimes you read the web and what these companies talk about on the values in the web, and everybody's got values up on the web. And let me tell you, sometimes you look at what the values are, and they're not what the company lives. I looked at Oracle's values, and I kind of rolled my eyes when I looked at what the value set was relative to what the company is. And it was interesting. So I went back and I said, well, what are a couple of tech companies that I think really do operate with a strong value set? And you kind of have to go back. You know, you go back to sort of the beginning of technology. So let's sort of start at the beginning. IBM. You know, where else are you going to start? 1962, Thomas Watson Jr. created 3 IBM basic beliefs that they hold to this day and are very foundational in the culture of IBM. You probably know what these are. Respect for the individual, customer service, and excellence. I think that's very true. I mean, it's very consistent with IBMers I've known. I think it's deeply imbued in the culture of IBM. And you got to give IBM credit because it is, and I could have a whole lecture on this, but it is one of the companies that has remade itself through industry transitions and did so. We were just talking about when Lou Gerstner came in, which we found out we ultimately determined was 1993, and it is a company that has remade itself from some fairly dark times. And I would posit that one of the reasons why it was able to do that successfully is because it had a strong value set-based culture. And companies that don't have that might not have that. Let's take a look at a company that is kind of struggling right now, but is very much a values-based company. In 1989, David Packer wrote The HP Way, and this was based on some original values that HP did in as early back as 1957. You know, and these are really good ones too. Belief that people want to do a good job. I love that one. I think that's very true. Our customers expect quality and lasting value. Open and honest, earn trust, teamwork, and innovation. Fundamental value sets that are critical and are foundational to what that company is about. It's sort of lost its way for a while, right? I mean, I don't know that it's operated with that value set over the last 10 years. And now, you know, we'll see what happens. Meg Whitman's in charge. I had the opportunity to talk to Meg not that long ago, and she said in that conversation that one of the things she was seeking to do is return the company to the value set of what David Packard wrote in the value set of the founders way back in this case, 1989. So I think that's a great thing, and I hope Meg is really successful. But then, you know, let's sort of take a look now and say, okay, let's look at some other sort of icons. I kind of made a comment about Oracle. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about Oracle. It's a complicated company. Let's talk about one that's arguably the most successful, I mean, pretty unambiguously the most successful company on the planet, which is Apple right now. I'm obviously undergoing a very significant change given, you know, the passing of Steve Jobs and the impact that has on not just Apple, but the overall industry. I mean, it's interesting here. I mean, you look at the value sets that Apple has posted, they're actually very consistent with, I think, the consumer experience of Apple as a company. Great products. It's an insanely great products. You know, simple, not the complex. Focus, say no. They're good at that. It's amazing how good they are. Deep collaboration and cross-pollination across our groups. They do that. They are really good at that, actually. I think it's very top-down driven, but they are good at that. They are fundamentally good at that. Don't settle for anything less than excellence. That is clear in the Apple mantra, and you see it in all their products. The sort of challenge, I think, about Apple is I mean, I was an acquaintance of Steve's, and obviously an incredibly great man that did amazing things for his company and for the world in many ways. But he was a difficult guy. And, you know, that was relatively clearly immortalized in Isaacson's book on him. And he was pretty abusive to people and had a very difficult persona around him. And I mean, I ask the question, do you have to be that way? Do you have to be that way to be as successful as Apple? It's a great question, isn't it? I mean, I think that Apple is a unique company in what they've done. And I don't think it's possible to replicate it without a persona like Steve Jobs. I think it's not replicatable. It's not a model that I as a manager can emulate. You know, I think if you came in and said, I'm going to teach leadership Steve Jobs style, how could you do that? I mean, unless you somehow had his DNA and could clone him, I don't see how you could possibly recreate that. And the interesting question for Apple ultimately is, without Steve there, how successful can the company be? I thought the most amazing thing, there was an article in, I believe it was Fortune about a year ago, that talked about Apple and the culture, and this was when Steve was still very much, I mean, obviously quite ill, but still very much in charge of the company. And it showed the org chart of Apple. You know what it looks like? It's a bullseye. Honest to God, it's a bullseye with Steve in the middle and everything around him. Is that a replicatable model for leadership? I mean, it's amazing and it worked, and he's a unique individual and could pull it off. But it's an interesting thing, and it says something about leadership and value sets that are quite interesting. Let's sort of go to a couple more. I mean, I think that one that is that I'm very close to home on is Microsoft. I spent 23 years at Microsoft, and I saw the good, I saw the bad, I saw the ugly. And I mean, I've been in a lot of different meetings, in a lot of different circles. I was there when IBM and Microsoft divorced. I was in the room. I testified in the DOJ trial. I was one of the 12. Fortunately, I was the last one, and Judge Jackson wanted to go fishing that afternoon, so my agony ended a little earlier than it might have otherwise went. But I managed to be skewered by David Boies personally in public. I had to answer to hundreds of emails that were quite embarrassing. Fortunately, almost none of them were mine. I'm very proud of the fact that I don't think in all that trial, there was a single really bad email from me. But I had to defend a lot of ones that are pretty hard to defend. And and I'll tell you, I love Microsoft. It's a great company, and I loved it then, I love it now, and a lot of great people at Microsoft. But one thing about Microsoft, it's not a values-based company. That's not the foundation of that company. And of course, if you look at the web, there are values on the web. And they're good values. Integrity and honesty, passion for customers, willingness to take on big challenges, self-critical. There is no problem with self-critical at Microsoft. They are good at self-critical questioning. That is a skill set. Accountable, generally speaking, I think that's true. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. In 23 years at Microsoft, all the time I spent there and all the things that I did, I spent less time as a manager, and I was a senior manager for 15 of those 23 years. I spent less time talking about values at Microsoft in those 23 years than I spent in 6 months at Juniper. So I switched to Juniper in October. The values have been a subject, a core of the conversation at Juniper. I spent more time talking about it. There's more focus on it in the 6 months I've been there than in all that time at Microsoft. And that's not in the last 6 months. That's been true for as far as I can tell with the company since its founding. And it's because its founders, Pradeep Singh and Scott Cairns, are very values-based people. You talk to Scott, and Scott's chairman of Juniper right now, and he's almost philosophical. There's a ton to learn from this guy. And he is, you can see he really deeply cares about people. And, in fact, like all of us, it's one of his weaknesses, right? He cares so much about people, he sometimes had trouble making decisions, and, blah, blah. There's always two sides to all of these sorts of things. But that caring of people is foundational in Juniper. And so it's not actually very surprising that that a guy coming from Microsoft and having been in that sort of an environment and sort of living through, like I say, the good, the bad, and the ugly of that, would gravitate to a very values-based culture like Juniper. And the values there, authentic. Used to be used to be humble, by the way. It was changed to authentic because it was viewed as being humble, was viewed as being too self-effacing, really. And so it was changed to authentic. Trust, excellence, bold aspirations, meaningful difference. Those are lived values at Juniper, and it's really quite interesting to see it. So one of the interesting questions is when you look at the new stalwarts of the technology world, what are their value sets? And how deeply imbued in their culture are values? And so if you look at a couple of them, and it's kind of interesting if you look at these. I was looking at the web, and Google's sort of well-known one is "Don't be evil," which I kind of go, what? I mean, I'm not exactly, I guess that's better than be evil, but maybe not as good as do good. I don't know, where does that fall in that spectrum? I'm not sure. They have some public ones focusing on the user, fast is better than slow, democracy on the web, I'm sure they believe in that. But it's interesting, it's interesting to understand, it sort of speaks a lot. I mean, I like Google, I think they're a great company, but it's a little hard to grab a hold of, it's a little amorphous, and it's interesting, I don't know that value has been fundamental there. Facebook, the new darling of the Bay Area. And doing a lot of great things, really having a massive impact on the world and really helping to have significant cultural change and significant influx of democracy in many parts of the world right now. You see the things that are their values. It's freedom to share and connect, free flow of information, transparent process, one world, that's good. But it's interesting, it still doesn't speak to that integrity point. And I think when you look at both Google and Microsoft, certainly, Google, and Facebook, I think you get back to that integrity point as one of the question marks people have, which is what is the value set that's really driving this company? And you know, we see kind of this erupting for Google right now in the plethora of lawsuits and issues, government sort of investigations that they're under right now, something that's quite familiar to me, having lived through that. And Facebook is not quite there at this point in time, but I think the areas of business that they're in will certainly prompt the potential for that. So I asked the question, and this is the question, and I'll give you a couple of ideas about it, but I'm not going to fully answer the question. The question is why is it that technology companies, or modern technology companies, have not had strong, are not based on, or not building on these strong value sets, and particularly focusing more on the value sets associated with the integrity and the customer. And that's sort of the foundational point I'm getting at, getting back to the customer and the integrity. And I have a couple of reasons that I'll give that I've thought of, and I don't think there's no research paper that I've done that would tell you the answer to this, but I thought it was an interesting question to ask and worthy at 7:30 in the evening on a Tuesday night to ask this. My first one is the most obvious one, which you got to put in, which is these are really young companies. You know, they were founded by people in their 20s. People in their 20s are not necessarily, as they get out of school, thinking about value sets. That's not where the foundation they're thinking about. They've got a business, you know, they've got a technical challenge they're solving. They've got a business challenge. They're go, 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 go. They're not necessarily thinking that. And I think that's a significant part of it. And you know, maybe the difference with Juniper is that Pradeep and Scott were a little bit older, and they've been through some experience when they founded Juniper, so they built value sets in. And certainly Thomas Watson Jr. and David Packard were a little further along in their career. I mean, it may have happened in 1962, but that doesn't mean it happened immediately at IBM. In fact, it didn't. What didn't happen with Thomas's father, it didn't happen there. It happened later. And the HP way was written well into HP's existence in 1989. So maybe this has to do with just the age of the company, the maturity of the company. The other one that I think is interesting to posit out there is that technology does have a different aspect to it, which is industries like retail, for example, are relatively static over a period of time, and they're built on the relationships with customers. Technology, at least in many cases, technology companies view that they're trying to catch waves of technical innovation that are happening, and if they don't catch them and ride them, they will crash, and they will crash over them. So there is perhaps a tendency for people to be more brash and more focused on winning, especially in a world where technology companies, more than in other industries, tend to have more of a winner-take-all attitude. So perhaps the leaders of these companies, whether consciously or unconsciously, are willing to do some things that might, in some sense, compromise some of these fundamental values, but do so for what they believe is the long-term success of their company. And there's some truth to that, I think, in the sense that you've got to be there at the beginning, and the amount of success that you can achieve is often determined by how early you are in terms of catching the technological shift that's happening. Certainly we've seen that with Apple recently with the iPhone, where by being at the beginning of that, or the iPad, they've been able to reap the lion's share of the profits. And so perhaps doing some things, breaking some glass along the way, might be viewed as being forgiven by the leaders of that company. The question is, and this is the one I leave you with, is does it need to be that way? Does it need to be that way? And I actually don't know the answer to that question, because I haven't founded a company that's gone on to take over a major industry. I've participated in companies that have been in that world, and I've seen how that works. But I'm not Bill Gates, I'm not Steve Jobs, so I haven't done that. I will tell you that for me, I think that I would rather operate every day and wake up every day and be able to get in the mirror and say that yesterday I did live the set of values that I think are important, which certainly start with integrity, and feel that whatever I've done has been consistent and upheld those important values. I would rather live that than not. And so I would choose to do that, regardless of whether it means I can win super big. I do think you can win, by the way. I really do believe you can win Can you crush your opposition? Well, maybe that's not what the value is supposed to mean anyway. But you can sure feel a lot better about yourself. With that, thank you very much. And I'll be glad to take any questions.
So just before we move into questions, I have to say I cannot imagine a better talk about leadership for Harvey Mudd College. I don't know of an institution that is more values driven. I certainly, among academic institutions that I've been part of or had the opportunity to spend time with, I've never been part of such a values-driven institution. And integrity, particularly because of our honor code, is really a huge part of who we are. So let me open it up for questions. But thank you, that was amazing.
Great. And thanks for that honorary Harvard MBA, by the way. I appreciate that.
Oh, but wouldn't you be better off with Harvey Mudd?
That would be great, too. Yeah.
If you become a trustee, they might give you an honorary degree eventually.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks.
But I have actually a real question. You talked about the values that Juniper has. How does that shape your day-to-day schedule? What do you do?
It's imbued in the culture. It really is. And frankly, like all things, there's a good side and a downside to some of these things too. I talked about how the original value was there that really came from Scott of being humble, and it was one which very much is Scott. If you know Scott, he's a humble guy. And I think it was viewed as a value set that actually, in a sense, was holding the company back, which is why it was changed to authentic, in a focus of trying to say, hey, we can still be authentic to who we are. We can hold our values important and be real. But that doesn't mean, we shouldn't try and downplay what we're doing. So that's the kind of thing at one level that where values have an impact, and you have to be very careful and thoughtful about it. But the focus on integrity, the focus on the customer, the focus on innovation is very much in the culture set of what Juniper is all about. And the thing about Juniper, that we're a relatively small company, 4.5 billion, 9,000 employees, but recognize we're competing against Cisco, which is literally roughly 10 times our size. And that, that's our primary competitor. And then we're competing against Huawei, which is 20 times our size in China. I mean, Huawei is just gigantic in terms of how fast it's grown. So we have significant, much larger competitors in the industry. And by fundamentally understanding the value set that Juniper has, it allows us to engage our energy and work together to do what we do well. I mean, we've come to the conclusion that we can't be successful in the market unless we are able to provide a solution for the customer that is really differentiated relative to these other folks. Because if we're just as good as Cisco is, we don't get the deal. We have to be markedly better. Often that means we're much faster, we're much more cost effective than the competitor's product. And so, things like innovation become a very critical part to the success of the company. And we've come to recognize that that really is this combination of hardware and software innovation. It turns out we kind of need both to be successful. So it's very common, when we are sitting there making decisions and in meetings talking about what we're trying to do strategically, it is common that that value sets are drive the conversation. And let's talk about what we're about and how does this relate to our values.
I enjoyed your talk, and I witnessed a vice president, one of the brothers at Nordy's, deal with a lady down at the beach, very wealthy lady, you could see on a pair of shoes. And he reached into his pocket and he took out the money that she said it was, and just gave her the money.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you an interesting thing. I had trouble with a Toyota, and on 2 occasions I dealt with the vice president's assistant in Torrance, and I dealt with her car on a Honda. And since Mr. Honda died, and I own both stocks, I own Toyota and both of them, Honda lost it, in my opinion. And what you're talking that happens, and the company's word has to stay good.
Agreed.
It just has to stay good, and it has to be the real McCoy, as you described it. And I can tell you, I just recently dealt with Honda, and I know how to deal with Honda, and I have the resources to do whatever needs to be done. But what you talked about was really important, and that is what makes real companies and real companies who operate. It's like the coffee company. Starbucks, right?
Another strong value system.
Yeah, they have a strong value system. They have a real system, and the president cares about what he talks about. He gives his workers health benefits when they first start. I mean, I own Walmart too, but Walmart doesn't do it. But Starbucks.
No, it's a difference in these companies. I think one of the things you kind of get back to is I have a view that I drive through my teams, and I think it's such a simple one. It's so simple to operate on this, which is customers make smart business decisions. If you just assume that your customers are making the best decision they can given the information they have, and I think this is true, I mean, I deal mostly with business customers where there's staffs to do research and stuff, and they're very well educated on the products they buy. They're much less influenced by, a TV ad or something than you might be as a consumer. But I think consumers make the best decision, great decisions for themselves too, but in business it's very true that customers make great business decisions. And if you think about what you're doing at any moment in the context of the relationship with that customer. And I've often said to people that when dealing with customers, recognize that your relationship with this customer, our relationship, the company's relationship with this customer, will long outlast what we're doing today. And we'll be selling software to this customer 100 years from now. And so that relationship is paramount. And we need to focus on building it and strengthening it. And you often find one of the interesting things is that when a customer is having a really serious problem with one of your products, like really serious, it's brought their network down in the case of Juniper, or Microsoft some significant databases down, or they can't roll out Windows or whatever it is, they're having a significant problem. Depending on the way the company acts to that customer, that can be an event that either destroys their relationship with the customer or strengthens it beyond what it ever was before. And I think that, again, I think that's very true. Again, it's interesting, I don't think it's that widely viewed in tech. Tech, I think, struggles with it a fair amount, but I think it's just as real in tech as it is in Toyota versus Honda.
Well, going back in history a little bit, I think another important aspect is just how a company needs to decide just what business it's in.
No, I agree with that too.
I want to go way back to the slide rule, and there was Post and Pickett and Teufel and Esser, okay, and they lost out to Hewlett Packard and Texas Instruments because they misread what they were in the business of making slide rules, not doing technical calculations. And similarly, we had a lecture last week about IMAX where they rethought about how they were going to provide their product, and ultimately it's the quality of the product and how it serves the customer and the need that seems to be a little bit more important than I mean, I really resent how Microsoft dominates the market compared to Apple. I remember the old days when it was 90% versus 10%.
You don't anymore though, do you? It's kind of shifted these days, right?
So it's one thing that the ultimate decider of is not so much the culture as recognizing what the customer wants and how you can provide it.
I agree. I think focus is a really important thing, and this is an area where you've got to give Steve Jobs and Apple credit because they're very good at focusing and they're very good at not doing things. And one of the things I do think is really interesting, and one of the views I had when I was changing companies was I sort of did a look at the industry at the points of transitions for companies and how companies succeeded in going through that. And if you look at, and again I'm focusing on tech here because that was the career I pursue, If you look at companies, there's a sort of a natural thing that happens with successful companies, which is that companies enter a market, and if they have a successful product that gets a significant share in a market, they wind up growing with that market, and the company will be able to achieve 20%, north of 20% growth for a number of years until that market hits some point of saturation globally. At which point their growth falls down to the more replacement sort of cycle, and Wall Street kind of gets upset because they want to see 20+% growth. So, no, it's very true. CEOs struggle to how to take a company that's been growing at this rate and keep growing. And very often what companies do is they move into other markets in the expectation that by doing other things, they can replicate that growth in other businesses. And more times than not, they are not successful at it. And the number of failures associated with it are much greater than the successes. The successes that are relatively notable, you can look at Apple, obviously, with the realization that, and again, I think it often comes back to focus. What is the essence of what this company does? In the case of Apple, the essence was building great consumer devices and products. And the recognition that didn't mean Macintoshes. It meant things that computing devices that people loved. So they went to the iPod, they went to the iPhone, they went to the iPad. That's all consumer-focused devices, very centered to the heart of what the company is. Another successful example, I think IBM. IBM looking at with Gerstner coming on board, recognizing that the essence of success was not in the hardware and software they're building, but in their understanding of the customer, and then branching out and focusing on an adjacent area of consulting, and then making a significant business there. There aren't a lot of great examples, though. You look across the industry, there just aren't that many great examples of this, and more companies tend to struggle with this. So that kind of gets to your point. Knowing what you're about and focusing, I think, is key.
Sometimes they make mistakes. I at one time owned an IBM PC Junior.
I recall the device with the chiclets. With the chiclets.
I donated it to a museum over here in
the keyboard that nobody could type on, which is surprising because IBM actually made the best keyboards in the world. Still make really good keyboards, or Lenovo does, I guess.
So one of the things that's changed in high tech is that all these companies have to get along.
Sort of.
I have an iPhone. It loads Google apps on it. It has Microsoft apps on it. You build routers.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to talk.
They have to work with everything in the industry, of course.
Whereas, if you were building cars, you didn't want your competitors to know what you're doing. You didn't want them to know what the standards are.
That's right.
So my question is, when it comes to values, has that really changed the playing field? If you don't play nice with your competitors, you may get shut out of the marketplace.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I, for a number of years at Microsoft, led our interoperability work, and one of the interesting outcomes of the DOJ trial was the fact we need to document all of our protocols, which was kind of an odd thing because it had nothing to do with the trial, and it literally got tacked on in the end of the consent decree, and it turned out to be one of the most difficult things we've ever tried to do as a company, and it almost killed us in some sets of ways. But that interoperability that you're talking about is critical, and one of the things I argued for a long time, and I think it's generally held at Microsoft, is this is very healthy for the business. And it turns out that customers want our products to interoperate with everybody else's products, so doing a great job with that was very critical. And historically, the fact that one of my products only works with another one of my products was viewed as a competitive differentiator. But I mean, ultimately, I've always had the view that your products still have to be the best products for customers, not just because they're the only thing that works with this other product over here, but because they really solve the problem better than anyone else's, and that enables that interoperability.
Well, in the olden days, we're going back 20 years, Microsoft invited open programming, and Apple was closed shop. They didn't want anyone else except them developing the software to run on their machines, and it hurt them.
I mean, Apple always had Microsoft actually wrote for the Apple Mac, years and years ago in the early 1980s. But I mean, clearly incubating and growing a developer ecosystem is important. It is still true Apple is the most closed, tech company on the planet today in many, many dimensions. I mean, they're the most secretive, and they're the most restrictive in what runs on their devices. But frankly, it's a lot of their appeal, and the reason why people like the product so much is they're able to control the experience and They can make a good experience because of it. And you see it in Android. I mean, we build anti-malware. Juniper builds anti-malware software for devices, and we can't build it for Apple. Apple won't let us. They won't even let us. You know, and we build it for Android. And you know what? Android needs it, and Apple kind of doesn't.
So something that you've sort of talked around is sort of the power difference between the consumer and companies, particularly in tech, and the ability of the consumer to make an informed decision. Because something that you mentioned is that with businesses, they generally make the best business decision, and while customers do a good job of that, in some cases there are things where you don't really have a choice. I mean, you could use Bing instead of Google, but it'll be
Some of us do.
It actually works fine. I use it all the time. Actually, you could try. Give it a try tonight. You'll find it works fine.
Switch back to MySpace instead of Facebook, but you wouldn't.
Right.
You could try
That one I'm with you on.
And so, how much do you think that impacts the need for values? I mean, with things like customer base, things like Nordstrom or Coach.
I think it's. I mean, in a way, you're getting at what I tried to say, where I talked about how companies. In tech, it's often a first winner take all kind of situation, and so I think it sometimes, and this is a theory. I mean, there's no proof on it. I think that it does change the focus of the leadership within these organizations to win at basically any cost. And the question is that a durable approach in the long run? And I think the case is, the jury is still out on that. And it will be interesting. I mean, we saw in the case of Microsoft that it was very costly. You just say it that way. It was very costly. It was difficult to live through. And anybody you cannot imagine how painful it is when the government of the United States declares war on you as a company. You cannot win. You cannot win. We did not win, if you remember. And we were just dumb for trying, frankly. That was because we thought of it, and I'll just keep going on this. That's because we thought it was legal, and it's not. It's actually values-based and other things. But the question is, if you look at take Facebook as an example, which is, it's right on the edge of some really interesting and difficult issues right now. Consumer privacy, versus advertising revenue. I mean, it sort of comes down to that. I mean, I hate to be so simple, but it sort of comes down to that. And at what point does the rights, the stockholders of the company overtake in importance the rights of the individuals that are participating and helping to enable that? And I would posit that the company would do well by establishing some very clear values that it could express to its consumer base and use as a durable foundation. I know of no such values that I would say that they have that I would say would establish that. Certainly the ones they publish on the web don't have that characteristic. And the behavior doesn't exactly have it either. So I mean, the question really is in a world where technology shifts are guaranteed to come, if you don't have that fundamental set of trust with your customers, what will happen? It's interesting. I mean, I'm not going to say that's why MySpace lost it, but they sure lost it. I mean, I think it's complicated reasons why they lost it. I'm not proposing that it was values and trust or anything else that caused MySpace to lose their customer base. But to your point, they've lost it, and they're not going to get it back. And could that happen to Facebook someday? I'm not saying it will by any means, but I don't know. It's an interesting question to ask. Yeah.
So on the topic of, I guess, within a company, maintaining values, because you were talking about how carrying values through an organization despite changes in leadership or changes in outside context is really important. And I definitely agree with that. I think that's one of the things that make Harvey Mudd continue to be such a successful college. Well, college continue to be so.
Yeah, it's probably true.
But whose role is it to maintain the values?
The leader. The leaders of the company.
How? I guess then the real question is how.
How do you lead in anything? You get people. Let me say, it's sort of the title of the talk: leadership by example. Right? That's the real answer to the question: is you live it, and you demonstrate it every day. And values aren't real if the leaders of the company don't live the values. If the leaders of the company imbue the values, they're in their pores, and their decision making and everything they do demonstrates that on a daily basis, then others will follow. If the if the values are written on a website and they're not followed daily by the leaders, which is the case in some companies, then they're not followed, and the values won't really mean anything. They'll be meaningless. Yep.
How do you feel an IPO, or being a public company versus a privately held one, can affect a company's values? There's an issue with Facebook, and I've read some fears that one of the values, fail fast, might get lost post-IPO because investors won't want to take that kind of risk.
Well, fail fast is actually, I mean, it's an interesting, I mean, there's to your broader point, I'll answer in a second, but to the specific one, I think fail fast is probably a good. I don't think it's a value. I just don't think it's a value myself. It's a business approach. It's a business approach, and it's a good business approach. You know, it's never smart to throw good money after bad. And so you want, when you want to innovate, you want to think about ideas, you want to allow ideas to incubate, you want to get rid of the ones that are not going to pay off as quickly as you can. It's a good, sound business approach and shouldn't necessarily change post-IPO relative to pre-IPO. You know, in terms of more fundamental values, it'll be interesting. I mean, the difference between a public company and a private company is a public company is under a great deal more scrutiny. They're much more closely regulated by the government, and that is very significant these days. And there are very significant consequences to not following that, including in some cases we've seen a number of executives go to jail. You know, I always had this view. This is an aside. I had a business manager who, you know, was previously my lawyer, and you know, I always told Craig, you know, your first job is, remember, no orange jumpsuits. I do not look good in orange. And so make sure I don't do anything wrong here. And so it's always good to have that. So there's a bit of that, and I think the other thing is you're under the scrutiny of your shareholders, and you have a lot more. You have an obligation to that, which is actually quite significant. And you know, it'll be interesting to see, you know, how that evolves. I mean, as long as the company is growing like mad and shareholders are making money, they tend to forgive a lot, and they tend to be not very forgiving at all when that doesn't happen.
Okay, last question, Cynthia.
At Juniper, when you're making a decision whether or not to hire someone, is there anything in particular that you do to ascertain whether or not the person sitting in front of you or you're considering to hire will live the values that Juniper?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have, one of the things I think I'm very impressed with this company, Juniper. Juniper has a lot of maturing to do, by the way. Just the first thing I'll say is, like all companies, there's all sorts of opportunities for Juniper to mature and get better. But one of the things that, you know, given that it's such a people-focused company, it's not very surprising that it has actually a very developed and I think a very very advanced, you know, progressive, is the right word, very progressive approach to evaluating people, and our review process I think is quite good. And we have this concept of a J player or not a J player, and it's pretty simple, which is if you live the Juniper values, you know, and are able to successfully do your job, you're a J player, and if you don't, then you're not. And ultimately we actually rate, you know, annually we rate people as to whether they're J players or not, and you know, and it's a straightforward way to say, well, this is how you need to manage our people, either because they're ineffective in their job, because they can be ineffective, or because they're not living the value set that Juniper has that's important. And you know, as we're interviewing people, you know, one of the key criteria is, you know, will this person operate with the Juniper values, and will they fit in with the culture? And you can ascertain that fairly. Is there a specific set of interview questions? No, not that I know of. Maybe there's some canned ones people use, but I'm not aware of them. I've also only been there 6 months, so I don't know everything everybody does. Not that I ever will. I do know that a part of the feedback that I see on employees is whether people believe that this person is a J player, whether they believe they'll live the Juniper values, and you can tell pretty easily. It turns out that there are probably more people that want to live these kinds of values than don't. I actually think that's true. So it's not like all of a sudden, I mean, I got a question earlier today when I was talking about this, about whether it felt like it was limiting the number of people that we could hire because we have these values, it's a more values-based company. And I really don't think so. I mean, there's certainly smart, capable people that we won't hire at Juniper because we don't believe these people will uphold the values. I know a lot of them from Microsoft, by the way. and you know, one of the persons said that, you know, Juniper has hired a few people from Microsoft since our CEO came from Microsoft, and he's brought a few people in. And one of the statements there was, the nice people go to Juniper. I mean, it's
Remember what I said about him?
and so, you know, but the funny thing is those other folks can actually be very effective, and they can get a lot done, but they break a lot of glass. I mean, they cause a lot of problems along the way. And, you know, one of the things that you always sort of decide ultimately is it worth it? And, you know, I've always said, and in Microsoft this was this bizarre kind of equation because we were much more sympathetic to different approaches. But, you know, I always sort of rate, you know, here's the positives that this person has, and here are the negatives, and do the negatives outweigh the positive? And at Microsoft, it was kind of that simple an equation. But in the Juniper case, it would be your negatives are not allowed to be above this number. I mean, we have a maximum number of, you can only be so difficult and be successful at Juniper. Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing. That's a different way of saying the same thing. So it is assessed. With that, I thank you very much.